Hey guys, welcome back to another version of Shiji Poll. Today we're going to be talking about Venti, who is going to have his rerun banner in 3.1 alongside Sinnoh. Now, before I start talking about this character, I like to start all these videos by saying if you like this character's aesthetic, playstyle, whatever, like you try him out in the character trial and you just absolutely love this character and want to pull for him for that reason alone, go for it. This is not what this video is about. This video is just like helping those that are curious about how it works and how well Venti performs. That being said, do I think Venti is worth pulling? It's kind of a difficult question to answer. He is a good character when he works, and I'll get into that in just a bit. So this is probably one of Venti's most popular team comps, by the way. He does have maybe some variations of this with like Ayaka, but he isn't really used in too many teams because Kazuha exists, and Kazuha has more practical use than Venti, since Venti can be countered pretty hard. But let's go over his talents and his kit and whatnot, and we'll talk more about the character. So we have really just basic stuff here. There's Venti's normal attack combo. His charge attack where he holds his bow like this, and we have his elemental skill. There's the press version. It's just a quick, like, smallish AoE attack where it does damage and swirls, which is the most important part. And then there's the hold version, which looks like this, where it pushes you up and nearby enemies. It does take a while to charge though, and it makes sort of like this like free wind vortex for a while, and this is actually really helpful for exploring, but not so much in combat. Now his burst I don't have, so give me a second, let me get it and we're gonna showcase it. Alright, so we're in the middle of combat here, but here's his burst. I wanted to use this group of enemies here to showcase that it will pull smaller enemies, but not larger ones. So hopefully you noticed that it pulled in the treasure hoarders when I used it, but it did not pull the large samurai guy when I used it. So that is Venti's, both his upside and his downside showcased at the same time. So when you are going up against large groups of small enemies, think slimes, hilichurls, treasure hoarders, some Fatui members, it does work on the I'm gonna pause so I don't have to hear voice lines. It does work on some Fatui members like the electro mages, the gunners, but it will not lift up the fat Fatui dudes like the water and the cryo gunners, for example, and the electro hammer dudes. It will not pull them up like it does with the smaller units. So when you're going up against large groups of small units, Venti is amazing. He will group them all up. His burst has such a huge AoE and like a really powerful suction. It will still pull some big units, but you saw that it will not actually lift them up. Obviously this burst loses even more value against even larger enemies. Think of Ruin guard enemies or the new Ruin ones in Sumru. It will not pull them at all. It will not definitely not pull them into the burst and lift them up. And of course this does not work. His burst does not work on any bosses whatsoever. It's hard to get value from Venti during bosses because you can still swirl with his skill and do the resistance shred, which is great, but that's about it. You can't. His burst will just sometimes just go through bosses and it won't even affect them, and it's just not that great at all to use. That's why Kazuha is practically better, because you can still swirl with him as well. With Venti, you can't aim his burst, and that's something I've always had a problem with when it comes to using Venti. Sometimes he'll aim at a completely random enemy that you weren't trying to hit with his burst, because sometimes you're trying to hit it right like in the center of the enemy so that you can gather as much as you can. Sometimes he'll just go for some enemy off to the side and ruin your strategy. So let's look at the character's talents. you'll see that I haven't even leveled my character's talents at all. Oh, well, not at all, but like they're not high level. Like I would always usually recommend level 8 before doing it, but you really don't need to because you use Venti more for his CC and effect, not really so much the damage. So we'll talk about the normal attack, which is pretty standard. There's nothing fancy about it other than it has Animo when it's fully charged. Skyward Sonnet, we showcase that there's a press version, which just does a quick AoE Animo damage, and then the hold version where it kind of goes around Venti and it pushes you up and makes that wind tunnel for quite a bit. And it's useful for exploration, but not really so much for combat. Then we showcase the ult. What I didn't really showcase is that you can mix it with any of the regular elements that can be swirled. So Hydro, Pyro, Cryo, and Electro. And then because of Viridescent Veneer, they will lose the 40% resistance to said element. And you can only combine one element with the burst at a time. So keep that in mind. Alright, so his first passive talent is Embrace the Winds. And this is where I was talking about where when you hold Skyward Sonnet, you get that wind tunnel for 20 seconds. That's actually a passive ability he gets. So you don't get it at first, but you will when you level up Venti. Again, as I mentioned, useful for exploration and getting to some high places. Not much else. Stormeye is a pretty good passive talent. It restores 15 energy to Venti once his burst is done. And then it will also restore 15 energy to all characters that have the element that was combined with his burst. So that's actually really nice. And lastly, we have this, which decreases your gliding stamina by 20. And this does not stack with other characters that have this same passive. So that was okay. Now, for weapons, I actually do have his signature weapon, and it is pretty great. You do not need this, though. I just happened to pull for it when I was trying to pull for a Staff of Homa. I actually have 2 of them. But there are other 4-star options that are great. For example, Stringless is okay. If you're going for more damage, you do Elemental Mastery, of course. You can also do Favonius Bow for energy recharge. A Sacrificial Bow is okay, I suppose. Again, energy recharge is the reason why. Basically, any bow that gives you energy recharge or Elemental Mastery is decent enough. Like, you don't need damage on your bow because that's, again, you're not using Venti for his normal attacks or his charge attacks, at least in combat. You're using him for his swirling and his CC when he uses his burst. So picking a weapon for Venti isn't that hard. Artifacts, as I mentioned already, Viridescent Veneer, and you're just going to want to stack as much Elemental Mastery and Energy Recharge as possible for consistent burst time. And in fact, I don't even have an optimally built Venti because I wouldn't even recommend getting an Animo damage bonus goblet for him. I would recommend getting an Elemental Mastery one. And the reason I'm using this, though, is because I don't even have one available for him. It's so hard for me to get an Elemental Mastery goblet that's a, first of all, 5-star. I have these purple ones, but that doesn't matter, right? And then the other ones are being used by other characters. Elemental Mastery has been becoming such a really good stat that a lot of characters are actually starting to need it now, and it's hard to get it as a main stat on artifacts. Let's look at the Constellations. I'm gonna be honest with you about Venti's Constellations. He was the first character, first limited banner character that Hoyoverse ever released. So you're gonna see his Constellations actually kind of be weird and not that great. And I'll explain why. So let's start with the C1. Fires 2 additional arrows per aimed shot, each dealing 33% of the original arrow's damage. Why would you use this? Like I said, you shouldn't be using the aim shot with Venti during combat. It is going to fire 2 additional shots that do even less damage because, again, we do not build Venti in a way that you would build a DPS character with crit rate, crit damage, etc., or even attack percentage, because You're just using him for his skill and burst. So having a constellation that has to deal with his aim shot makes no sense. Let's look at the C2. So Skyward Sonnet decreases your opponent's animo resistance and physical resistance. Why is it physical resistance? Again, this is weird. When you're using Venti with a team, you want to use elements, right? Because he swirls with elements and his burst can combine with an element, right? So why is this reducing physical? You're not using a physical damage dealer with Venti. And even if you were, keep in mind Venti's burst lifts up enemies into the air. This makes him actually a bad teammate for certain melee characters, I should say, because they can't reach his burst. And then it says opponents launched by Skyward Sonnet suffer an additional 12% animo res and physical res decrease while airborne. So this is only going to work on smaller enemies, which I don't think is that useful because, again, smaller enemies in this game are usually easier to kill. The animo res isn't that great because, like I said, we're not using Venti for damage. You want him to just decrease the element that you're using him with. So, for example, in the comp that I'm using, you would want him to swirl with Cryo to reduce Cryo's resistance. Reducing animo here isn't going to result in a lot of damage. And then C3 and 5, we already know, right? +3 to skill and burst respectively, which again doesn't do much in the long run. And then we have C4, where when Venti picks up an elemental orb or particle, he will receive a 25% animo damage bonus. Now again, look at the wording. He will receive, not the team. So if you're using him with another animo character, it will not affect them. This is just his damage for skill and burst, and I suppose his aim shot. Not that great at all. And then finally we have his C6, which is targets who take damage from his burst have their animo res decreased by another 20%. If an elemental absorption occurred, then their res towards the corresponding element is also decreased by another 20. Now this one is good. However, it is a C6, which is not so good. So this would stack with Veridistant Veneer, and the corresponding element would get a -60% in total elemental res decrease. That is huge. Now, is this worth getting? Absolutely not. -40% from Veridistant Veneer is good enough. You do not need this. So this makes Venti a great character to just have at C0. He does not need any of his first 5 constellations. He doesn't even need his 6th one, to be honest. But again, it's just one of those effects that's actually good. It's actually a good effect. So that is Venti in a nutshell. Now you kind of see why it was hard for me to recommend this character. I do think he's good, again, when he actually is going up against crowds of enemies. I still use him in the Spiral Abyss, and even though I just showcased that he has low talent levels and, again, not even optimized artifacts, he does his job, which is to pull in a bunch of enemies and group them all together for you for your main DPS to burst them down in one go. I probably have some gameplay hopefully popping up in the center around here showcasing him helping me clear a domain really fast. He's really good for that kind of stuff as well. But yeah, Venti is a hard character to recommend these days because Hoyoverse keeps adding more and more enemies both in the overworld and in the Spiral Abyss that can just straight up ignore his burst. And in that scenario, that is when a character like Kazuha becomes more useful because of the elemental damage bonus he will give you instead, which will help out a lot. But yeah, that being said, Venti is still useful for exploration and just easier battles in general. But he does fall off really hard versus large enemies and bosses. So just keep that in mind when you're pulling for him. But anyways, that's going to do it for this video. I hope it was helpful in deciding whether or not you want to pull for Venti. If you have any more questions about the character, feel free to ask in the comments down below, and I'll do my best to answer them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.